The reason we're gathered together here today, of course, is to celebrate the racing activity of an Anderson native by the name of Bob Carey. And I must admit, I didn't know about Bob Carey. I wasn't even born yet, but I'm getting old now. But now I know about him. Bob Carey was a fantastic race driver, raced about everything they had in the late 20s and early 30s. And Donald will have more about that as we get to our luncheon later on. But we're here to recognize him as an outstanding race driver, and also the AAA, remember the original sanctioning body, American Automobile Association, was the original sanctioning body for what we now call IndyCar, and the championship trail and those things. And he was the 1932 champion of the AAA racing. Now, those guys raced from coast to coast. And so that's why we're here today, in honor of Bob Carey. I can remember right after I began working at the Speedway on the 500 radio network, which was 1962, that was my first year. And I remember I became friends with Jimmy Daywalt, the late Jimmy Daywalt. And Jimmy told me once, right after the war, and this probably occurred prior to the war, like when Bob Carey was around, but those guys would actually race virtually 5, 6, 7 nights a week. Midgets, sprint cars, whatever it was, they'd be racing. And he says, we never had time to get to the bank. He says, we always had the money stashed under our floor mats in our cars. Are you kidding me? And he says, I remember this, he said, there were occasions, and this was probably true in Bob Carey's racing career, there were times when the promoter would run away and they'd be paid with hot dogs and Cokes, all you could take. Not terrible. Well, it's changed a lot since then, but that's our purpose of being here today, and we're so happy to be here at this wonderful event here today. This is Anderson's 150th birthday. What a grand city this is. We're pleased to be opening the opening event for Anderson's 150 hours of celebration over the next week. We have some special guests with us today, and we're going to thank the organizations for their participation, the Herald Bulletin, the Community Hospital at Anderson, and the St. Vincent Anderson Regional Organization. They have a table here this morning as well. I have only been on the campus here at Anderson University one other time. It was a couple of weeks ago. I came up for a Colts practice, and they told me to go away. I couldn't play. So, but that's the story of my life. Of course, Anderson has a more recent heritage of having more great economic development coming here in Madison County and in Anderson, Indiana. And that's a blessing indeed, because Anderson, my thoughts of Anderson go back to when I was a little guy and a young kid. I can, believe it or not, I can remember we didn't have television in those days. They didn't have television when you were little? No, they didn't. But anyway, I can remember this, listening to the state tournament on the radio. And the Anderson Indians were playing, and they had a guy who was by the name of Jumpin' Johnny Wilson. Anybody here remember Jumpin' Johnny Wilson, for heaven's sake? All right. And you know, the interesting thing about that was many years later, I had an old high school friend at Shortridge that was a teacher at, oh dear, now I can't think of the name of the school. High school in downtown, used to be the old Manual. What was that high school? Anybody remember? Well, anyway, he said, why don't you come down Saturday? We're going to come down and just shoot around in the gym for a while. I said, okay, fine, I'll come down and play a little ball with you guys. And that was when I got to meet Jumpin' Johnny Wilson. And he was probably in his 40s in those days. And then a couple of years ago, I met him. Does anybody here know George Smith? George Smith Music, Anderson? Everybody knows George. I was up here for his birthday a couple of years ago. We went to high school together, and Jumpin' Johnny Wilson was at his birthday party that they had at the Paramount downtown. And so I've always kind of had a soft spot in my heart for good old Anderson and the Wigwam and the Indians and all that. It's just terrific. So I'm happy, really happy to be here today. And this Anderson campus is just absolutely gorgeous. You're blessed to have a university here. And it's always fun to go out to see a high school or a college football game every weekend. And Anderson certainly upholds that in their division. They have a great racetrack here. Boy, oh boy, do they ever. Is there anyone here that has not been to the Anderson Speedway? One person. Okay, that's all right. Thank heavens for that. Just one. I can remember several years ago when my youngest son was about 12 or 13 years old. He's now 30. But I remember one time they used to have that race on New Year's Day. Rain, snow, sleet, whatever. At the Anderson Speedway, they'd have a hobby stock or jalopy race. And it was 60 degrees that day. And I said to my son, I said, hey, you want to drive up to Anderson for the race? And we did, came up here and sat, froze ourselves to death, but it was a wonderful day. And been here for the Little 500 once or twice, so you're blessed to have that here too. It's a great racetrack, no question about it. Happy to have it here. Want to mention the Sesquicentennial sponsored by Bob Carey Memorial Race at Anderson, which was August 1st. This race had the closest finish in the history of the sanctioning body when it calculated 1/32 of an inch between first place and second place. And the first place winner was Kyle O'Gara, who is part of the Sarah Fisher family and organization, and second place went to Dameron Taylor at the finish line. Ohio's 12-year-old Trey, 12 years old, running, what was that, midgets or sprint cars? I don't know. Used to be, you had to have a driver's license before you could even get in a race car, and then you had to be 21. Remember that? Am I right, Donald? See, I check everything with Donald. So anyway, 12-year-old Trey Osborne received the Bob Carey Up and Coming Award for his youth, his talent, and his determination. So now we're going to call on the mayor of Anderson, Indiana, and he, I'm sure, is here in the crowd somewhere, and here he comes. Mayor Kevin Smith will come to the stage and greet everyone.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. If no one said it so far this morning, welcome to Anderson, Indiana.
Yes, thank you.
We appreciate you being here. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the kickoff of Anderson's birthday, 150 years old. The Sesquicentennial. You know, it's such a great event, because what this is really doing is paying homage to so many people like Bob Carey, who were risk takers. They were courageous, they were persistent, they were hardworking, and they were dedicated. So many people that have walked life in Anderson, Indiana, that have really done so much for us as a community, and we appreciate it. And of course, the Anderson Speedway with a rich history of racing here, and so many of you love that sport, and we thank you for being here for our kickoff today. So again, thank you very much. It's my pleasure as the mayor of Anderson to have all of you here today.
And Brian Hassler, who's one of the founding members, is going to come up here and share a little bit with us about Irma. No, it's not a girl we're taking out tonight. It's the Indiana Racing Memorial Association.
Thanks, Howdy.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Howdy, and a great welcome to all of you. This is a fabulous event. Irma was founded when Mark Utzler, my co-founder, came to me and said, what can we do to honor the great Wilbur Shaw on the 60th anniversary of his death? So I contacted the state of Indiana and I said, well, if we raise some funds for this, can you get a marker, historic marker, for the state up to honor Wilbur Shaw? And their answer was, well, we've already done that. We've got a marker at the Speedway. That takes care of all racing. Well, we thought that the rich history of motorsports in Indiana, the birthplace of much of the racing that takes place, the racing capital of the world, deserve much more. So we started Irma, brought together great people like Bob Gates and Howdy Bell and Dick Mittman, Dave Bozell. Mark Utzler's going to be here in a little bit. A really great board. And we started putting markers up. Our first marker, and Bob Lemons is here too. Our first marker was at Winchester Speedway. And it was just a few days after that, I got a call from this crazy guy in Montana. His name was Jeff Schulte, and I quickly learned two things. Jeff talks a mile a minute, and he loves racing and had a great story to tell about his ancestor, Bob Carey. Now, I have to admit, I didn't know much about Bob Carey, but I started learning. And it became clear very quickly that Bob Carey was one of the people we needed to honor early in this process. Like many drivers, Bob Carey started by working at R&R, a racing shop, showing up at events, hoping he might get his break to drive, and he did. And Donald is going to tell us a lot more about that. But that's how a lot of drivers got their start. But the difference with Bob was he went straight to the front of the pack. And he stayed there throughout his career, capstoning that with the national title in 1932 and a historic and heroic race at Indianapolis 500 in 1932. Tragically, we lost Bob Carey in 1933 at Legion Ascot. And typically what happens in racing is one of two things. The family either continues to be involved in racing, or they kind of turn their backs to it somewhat and try to put it away because of the pain and the grief involved with losing someone in their family like that. Well, as I understand it, the Carey family took both paths. Bob's family tried to put it all behind them and went about their business. And I mean, they were still proud about Bob, but that was their way of dealing with it. Bob's brother's family continued in racing. And I understand a few years ago, and I hope I'm not taking your remarks, Jama. Shoot, I'm sorry. The family got together at Bob Jr.'s funeral and really came together around this. So fast forward to Jeff Schulte calling me. And we decided, yes, we have to do a Bob Carey marker. The family jumped in, and what we have today is probably the best event we have had yet with our first 6 markers, and it's because of the dedication and love of this family. So I want to say 2 things. Early on, one of the family members said that I am an honorary Carey, which I consider to be a badge of honor. But I want you to know that you are all members of the Irma family too. We've gotten very close to you. You've helped us in so many ways and been there with us as we've been growing. And to Jama and Liza, to Jeff and Doug, to Rick and Ron and Marlene, the entire Carey family, I want to say Bob Carey would be very proud of you coming together and doing this. So his determination lives on in this family. I also want to let you know a little bit about a project we're doing. It's Project 19. Like you being part of the sesquicentennial here in Anderson, we are part of the bicentennial for the state of Indiana next year. We were the 19th state in the Union, so we are about the business of trying to put up 19 markers by the end of 2016. This is the 6th. The next marker is Tony Holman on November 14 at the Speedway. And we have many more planned for next year to help tell the story of motorsports in Indiana. So I hope you'll be there with us. I hope you'll join us for future events and follow us on Facebook. Bob Gates does a great job with that. And we just thank you for the opportunity to partner with this family and help bring about this marker to honor a great driver who deserves recognition and to be remembered.
Thank you, Brian, so much. I'm going to ask now that Jama Blades, granddaughter of Bob Carey, comes up to speak on behalf of the Carey family, if you will, ma'am.
My first involvement in my grandfather's racing career was in June of 2005 when he was inducted into the Sprint Car Hall of Fame in Knoxville, Iowa. It was my privilege to go and be the recipient of that award on behalf of the family because at the time nobody else was available. If you talk to all my male cousins, they were chomping at the bit to go. But no one else was available. Knoxville, as many other people who don't know about the Carey family, had assumed Bob Carey had no living relatives. I'm the oldest of his 6 grandchildren. Because of my grandfather's death, and because my grandmother did not wish to lose anyone else to racing, racing was never part of my life. However, it seems to run lively in the blood of many other Carey family members. My grandfather's brother, Fred Carey, who also was from Anderson, became a state champion boat speed racer, soon after he started the sport after age 50. A number of my cousins have also been involved in careers in racing as drivers, mechanics, photographers, artists, graphic designers, including one who is presently involved with the Rahal Letterman Lanigan race team. Whether it was rudder or wheels, the Carey family has been part of the history of speed competition, from road racing to motocross, open wheel to soapbox hills, IndyCar tracks to quarter-mile ovals. You'll find the Carey family in the race or cheering from the sidelines. It has been so much a part of their life that they want me to love it as much as they do. When the family had our first meeting with the Irma board, I mentioned to all of them that I had ever been told about, that if my grandfather had lived, he would probably have been another A.J. Foyt or Mario Andretti. He just had that kind of will to race and love of racing. But a cousin from my father's generation quickly pointed out to me that perhaps if that had happened, I would have never been born, along with all of my siblings, because it probably would have meant that my grandfather would have traveled with my grandmother and my father, and he would have never met my mother. My father was only 8 years old when his father died, but throughout my life, I recognized in my father the same courage, persistence, and determination that my grandfather must have had. At age 48, my dad and mother sold out their property in Indiana, and within 3 years, also my siblings, and moved from Pendleton to Alaska, cutting down trees and building 4 cabins. They lived in the bush, which is what it's called in Alaska if you're in the wilderness, 50 miles from the nearest road. For 3 of those years, my father still flew his small plane to work every day. I'm the only one in the family who never lived there, and the reason being I was already married, had kids, and my husband said it was too far from a hot shower. My father flew his small plane not only to work, but to job sites all over the state to inspect the construction work that was done by his company. They lived lives full of adventure every day for 40 years. Standing on the bricks at Irma's Night to Remember last fall, I felt a bit of the excitement that my grandfather must have felt for racing. I recognized all those links in the Speedway and to my grandfather. Other than that, racing is in the Carey blood, and my father and my youngest brother are also named Bob Carey. I recognize the adrenaline rush, the anticipation of achievement and courage. And I think it's one of the reasons I was so thrilled by our presentation at Bob Carey Memorial Race at the Speedway, because I saw those same things in the eyes of Trey Osborne. He might be only 12, but I imagined that I was looking back over the generations to what my own grandfather must have felt at possibly the same age. I recently read an excerpt from a book published in 1944 which expresses my feelings well. That mysterious delight which springs up when we stand where our fathers have stood was unsealed. I've heard Donald Davidson tell on more than one occasion that he keeps running into Carey's. Is it any wonder? They are always at the Speedway. It seems that Carey blood circulates better when fed by the rev of the engine or the pass of the checkered flag. All our family members live all over the United States, but in recognition of Donald's interpretation of our family and the actual account of our family, I would like for everyone connected in any way with the Carey family to, at this point, please stand. But on behalf of all of us in the Carey family, we would like to thank the Indiana Racing Memorial Association, the City of Anderson, the Sesquicentennial Committee, and all who have been involved in honoring Bob Carey with not only this historical marker, but also this lovely luncheon. And thank you for making this event part of the great Anderson's Sesquicentennial celebration. We feel like Bob Carey has taken another checkered flag. May God guide you and bless you all. Thank you.
Now we're going to have the unveiling of this beautiful marker, and Ms. Blades is here, Lisa Blake, Brian Hassler, Bob Gates, and Mayor Smith. If you folks will come forward, please. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the unveiling of the Bob Carey marker here at Anderson University will be performed by the guests that we have up there, and we're asking you now to please unveil the marker. Was that okay, Mayor? Okay. By the power vested in me. And now it's an honor for me to once again introduce these gentlemen. I met this quartet at our Winchester unveiling, which was a little over a year ago at the 100th anniversary of the Winchester half-mile high bank, fastest half-mile track in the world, Speedway. Did I get all the plugs in on that? I think I did. All right. I'll introduce these gentlemen to you. Bud Gray, you can raise your hand or something. Dave Kelly, Alan Wasson, and Dennis Pratt. And they're going to sing for us Back Home Again in Indiana.
Back home again in Indiana, and it seems that I can see the gleaming candlelight still shining bright through the sycamores for me. The new moon haze sends all its fragrance from the fields I used to roam. When I dream about the moonlight on the Wabash, then I long for my Indiana home.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, now we're done with the basic program here. It's time for lunch, and Donald Davidson will be speaking at the lunch. So he never eats very much, which is a good thing, you know, when you have to speak, and that's how he stays so thin. And anyway, that will be taking place after we're about through with our lunches. So right now, we just thank all of you for being here. If we don't have an opportunity to later, it's been a wonderful day here at Anderson, and we just thank you all so very, very much. And God bless Anderson, and God bless America. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, an honor for me to introduce to you the ever lovely Donald Davidson. Yay! There you are, bud, in case you need it.
Thank you very much, Howdy.
You're welcome. You want to use that one?
Yeah.
It's hot.
All right, very good.
What do you want to do?
I'll sit down and we'll have a chat, okay? All right.
When he says chat, he means chat. I'll get this out of your way.
All right, does that work? Very good. Well, thank you, Howdy. And normally I was going to go straight into Bob Carey, but to defend myself a little bit, I did write to Sid, but I tried to be as delicate and unassuming as possible. And a number of the claims that apparently I've made, I never did make. But I did show up after, and as Sid did write me a very nice letter, and I came, and in fact, he helped me get a credential, and I wasn't going to do this, but I was very fortunate that I got there in time for the first qualifying weekend in '64, and a lady there was the director of ticket sales named Miss Frances Durr, had already told me that they would give me a bronze badge, which would get me in the garage area. And so I arrived and took advantage of that. And so I spent the late afternoon and early evening on the Friday in the garage area. And then the following day was the first qualifying day, and I couldn't get in the pits. And I was walking through the garage area and ran into Sid. And we had a conversation. I don't know if he remembered the letter or not, but I mean, he was so courteous that he wouldn't let on that he didn't. And so in short order, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a one-day pass, which they used to do in those days. And he said, I'll tell you what, he said, here's a temporary pit pass. Bring this back to me at the end of the day. And I said, well, thank you very much. Where will I find you? And he said, up in the tower, master control tower. I said, well, how will I get up there? He said, just come up. And as many of you here, and I bring this up only because Howdy started it off, and I kind of need to finish, and looking out there and realizing that probably many of you had this experience, in the old master control tower, I was astonished at the accessibility. And you didn't need a credential to go up in the tower. And you could go up the 3 flights or 4 flights or whatever it was and look into the broadcast booth with Sid doing the broadcast, and you didn't need any credential. And I was just astonished. Well, anyway, it ended up that I got into the pits with the temporary pass that he had given me, and one thing led to another, and within probably 2 or 3 hours, I had a silver badge. So I went from a bronze to the temporary to the silver. I think in what did I figure it out? It was like 19 hours or something like that. And so I was able to go up to Sid in the middle of the afternoon and say, thank you very much. Here's the, you asked for the pass back. Here it is. I have a silver. So anyway, Bob Carey. And before I touch on that, the Anderson heritage here, there were a number of people from this area. Jim McWithy lived here for a while. And then, of course, most famously, Ray Haroon actually lived in Anderson in the final years of his life. There's a little trailer court on the south side, probably, a mile, 2 miles from the Anderson Speedway, and that's where Ray Haroon lived. And I used to go see him, and what an honor and a thrill that was to have a standing invitation. So I would drive up from Indianapolis in circa 66, circa 68, and 67 rather, and then he'd come out, and this legendary character would be in pajamas and a dressing gown, and very slowly and methodically talk about pre-World War I. What an honor. But anyway, So, Bob Carey, when I was first in the area, and once I got my feet wet, I started to do talks. And in the late 60s and through the 70s, I used to do a lot of talks, and probably Howdy and maybe some others of you had similar experiences in that. There used to be hundreds and hundreds of service organizations that have all died out now, and secretaries, groups, and so on and so forth. So I would give a lot of talks, and you'd go to these little towns and, you know, father and son dinner, and the wives would cook the food, and, you know, you'd do the talk, and they'd give you $25 or something. And so I would do Q&A, and then when that was over, if it hadn't have come up during Q&A, then people would come up to me afterwards, and invariably somebody would say, I had a relative that drove in the Indianapolis 500. And I said, oh, who was that? Well, it's Bob Carey. Well, it happened so often that when somebody would come up to me and say, I had a relative that drove in the 500, and I'd say, Bob Carey. And they said, yeah. And so it just seemed like there was a large, extended family. Anyway, to talk about the man, as far as on the national scene, at least, he came out of nowhere. And I'm not sure that he ran AAA until 1932. Now, if he did, I haven't been able to find it in whatever resources that I have. He suddenly was there in very early 1932. And he won a race at Oakland, California, driving for Louis Meyer. And so we're going to be involved here with three different championships. There was the National Championship Circuit, which comprised of just a few but high-paying events. And then there was a very lucrative West Coast Championship that was actually more lucrative than the National Championship because there were so many races. And then there was races in the Midwest under AAA sanction. And so very early in 1932, he had hooked up with Louis Meyer, who'd already won the 500 one time. And how that came to be, I have no idea, but all of a sudden now he's driving. Louis Meyer drove for other people, but he also owned his own equipment, and it was all first-rate stuff. And he's got Bob Carey from Anderson, Indiana, driving for him at Oakland, California, and winning. And then another one very early, I think like in March of 32, was Imperial, California, better known probably as El Centro, and that is way down, not too far from the Mexican border, and he won there. And so I don't know this, but my guess is that when he came back to the Midwest to drive the Indianapolis 500 in 1932, the photo on the far right there. See, we don't normally have an audio-visual portion of the program, but we do photographs. So anyway, the car on the right is what he drove in the 32 500 for Louis Meyer. My guess, and whether this has any substance or not, he probably was leading the West Coast Championship when he came back to drive at Indianapolis. But whether he did or whether he didn't, I don't know, except that at the end of the year, he ended up 6th in the final West Coast points, and he only ran a few of the races. And so there was the West Coast standouts, and some of them would come back and run Indianapolis and then turn around and then immediately head back. And then there would be the Midwesterners, that some of whom would go out and spend the summer, even pass up the championship circuit to run the West Coast, or at the very least, go out there when the Midwest season was over, because they would run all the way through the winter. They would run in December and January and February. And so a number of the leading people, like Bill Cummings and Billy Arnold a little bit, but golly, I got painted myself into a hole here. But a number of leading, Howdy Wilcox II, they would go out there and rent an apartment, and they would all live out there through the winter. and then continue racing up through March until like mid-April, and then they would say, well, see you later, and then they would head back to the Midwest in time for Indianapolis. And so Bob Carey did that. Well, actually, he would have made 2 trips out there, but be that as it may. So he comes back to run Indianapolis for Louis Meyer. And again, I have no idea how they were hooked up, but Louis Meyer was one of the leading, if not the leading, one of the leading Indianapolis 500 drivers. And he drove for Alden Sampson, but he also owned that car that he would have other people drive. And in 1931, Myron Stevens, who was a driver, but much better known as a very successful car builder, but he would drive, and he drove that car in 31 for Louis Meyer, and Louis Meyer dropped out early with the Sampson, and so at some point he came in, Myron Stevens came in, and they did a driver switch. And this has got really nothing to do with whatever we're talking about, except that Lawson Harris, who was to ride with Bob Carey, had ridden with Myron Stevens, and when they made the driver switch, Lawson Harris got out of the riding mechanic seat, Myron Stevens got out of the driver's seat and got into the riding mechanic seat, and then Louis Meyer took over and finished the race in 4th place. So now it's 1932. Bob Carey qualifies that car, 14th, and it don't take long to get to the front. And I think at 20 laps he was running 3rd, and by 30 laps he was running 2nd. But it was going to get a little tougher from that point on, because Billy Arnold, who's a name that's just virtually forgotten, he was the man in the early 1930s. He was Vukovich Sr. in the early 1930s, and he won the 1930 race. He'd led 198 of the 200 laps. Nobody's ever topped that. And then he led virtually all of the laps in 31 while he was on the track until he crashed late in the race leading. And now in 1932, he's off, like Jack the Bear again. And so Bob Carey ran 2nd behind him for quite a number of laps. And then on the 60th lap, there was a checkup situation, and Billy Arnold took a base of action, which ended up with him hitting the outside turn 2 wall and going over the top. And he retired shortly after that. But anyway, rather than go off on too many tangents, that gave the lead to Bob Carey. And so he led for 36 laps. And in terms of time, because we weren't running 38-second laps in those days, that's probably close to an hour where, alcoholic beverages were being consumed on the infield, and Bob Carey from Anderson is leading for about an hour. And then going into turn 1, on the 96th lap, because he had led up, I think, anyway, almost to halfway, and he spun going through turn 1. And whether or not a tire let go, and he hadn't made a pit stop yet, by the way. They didn't do all of these ducking in under yellows. I mean, the only reason they'd have a yellow if somebody got upside down. So it was an enduro. And very often, the winner could get by on one stop. So we're almost to halfway, and he hadn't come in yet. So did he wear a tire down? We don't know. But it came to pass, if you like, that he spun. And whether he tagged the wall, I'm not sure. But he did lose a lot of time coming around to the pits. And by the time he arrived, another tire had gone flat. So he had 2 flat tires when he came in. And then they looked over the car, changed the wheels, and determined that the frame had been bent. So I'm thinking that he may have nudged the wall. So by the time they got him all fixed up and ready to go back out, that pit stop, I think, had been it was about 7.5 minutes, plus the time that he had lost in coming around on flat tires on an all-brick track. all the way around, bumpity, 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 bump. And so, would you like me to do that again? Bumpity, bumpity, yes, okay. So anyway, off they went, and he had dropped to 8th place. And in terms of time, I think he was about 8 minutes back. But in those days, you didn't have 20 cars running within a few seconds of each other. Everybody would get spread out. And you might have people towards the end of the race would be in a lap by themselves. So anyway, after a few laps, he was flagged in for an inspection. And I made a note in something I wrote that some people questioned why he would be brought in, and I don't know where I would have got that from, but anyway, it might even have been Louis Meyer, who I had several discussions with, but there was some discussion as to why would you bring him in. Anyway, they held him for about 30 seconds, looked the car over, and sent him back out. Well, it wasn't very long before he was back in again, and this time it was because it was to repair a shock absorber. And I think this took like 5 minutes and something. So by the time I think you get to 130 laps, he's back in 12th and about, I think it was like 12 to 13 minutes behind. So he made no pit stops after that. And I'll just throw this in a little bit, that Louis Meyer, once again, was out of the race with his own car. But while he had elected to take Myron Stevens out and put himself in 31, he evidently decided that Bob Carey was doing just fine on his own, and he's got a rhythm going and leave him. That's just a guess. And I can just hear Louis Meyer, I don't know that he told me this, but I could just hear him say, "We just figured the kid was doing fine by himself." That's terrible timing. Something went over, somebody hit the wall. Anyway, so he went ahead and finished the race but made no pit stops, I think, after the 125th lap. And it was around that time that he'd lost his goggles. Now, I don't know if they came off in the last pit stop and he left without them, or they blew off or whatever. But he ran for probably, another 2 hours at speed, trying to catch the field with no goggles. And he came in 4th, and you see that written on a piece of paper, or you look up the stats and say, oh, Bob Carey finished 4th. But what it doesn't tell you was all this other stuff that happened in the meantime. And when he crossed the line, I think he was about 7 minutes behind Fred Frame, who won the race. And so when Fred Frame took the checkered flag, Bob Carey would have been probably, another maybe 4 laps to go. But in those days, they let the thing keep going, and he was the 4th person to complete the distance. So anyway, then they went to Detroit, Michigan State Fairgrounds, 1 mile dirt track, with Louis Meyer, takes Bob Carey as the driver. And again, I would love to know how they hooked up several months before. And now he wins the race. He wins the Detroit National Championship race. And then they had another one at Roby, which was just right on the Illinois border. It was Roby, Indiana, but it's right hard on the border up in Hammond or Gary or somewhere up in there. And then they went to Syracuse, New York, and that was a fair date, New York State Fair. And I think it rained, or there was something happened that the race was called at 81 miles out of 100, but he was leading, so he got that victory. And then they went somewhere else. The final race was Oakland, and this was where he'd already won with the single-seater, and these were 2-man cars. And so they went to Oakland for the final, and Bill Cummings from Indianapolis won the race, but Bob Carey was second. So he won the national championship. Going into the last race, Fred Frame and Howdy Wilcox II had a mathematical chance to catch him, but he solidified the victory, or by the lead, and then added to it by finishing second. So he's the 1932 national champion. And as I say, I don't know that he'd run AAA until that, January, February, or whatever it was. And then he ends up 6th in the West Coast Championship. And then also, there was no Midwest Championship yet. Now, what we know is what eventually became the USAC National Sprint Car Championship used to be a Midwest Championship and an East Coast Championship separately. So from 1960 on back, there was no National Sprint Car Championship. You had the sectional titles. Well, the East Coast Championship started in 1932. Now, they'd been having races for years, and then AAA decided, let's put points on these races and see what happens, and maybe we can declare a champion. Instead of just having a bunch of races, we could actually have a point standing, so they did that with an experiment. They didn't do that in the Midwest until 1933. If they had in 1932, Bob Carey would have been the champion free and clear because of the fact that he won, I think, 2 races at Winchester and 2 races at Fort Wayne, which was a high bank track, larger than Winchester. That was a 5/8. And then also they ended the season in Detroit. And I'm not sure what this track was. It wasn't the State Fairgrounds, or maybe they had a half a mile within the mile, but there was a half-mile track, and they ran 3 consecutive weekends in September, and he won all 3. So he had at least 7 victories. So had points been applied, he would have won the championship by a huge margin. Anyway, we are coming down the stretch here because he went out to, after the Midwest season ended, he would have headed out to the West Coast to pick up where you could run the treacherous Legion Ascot Speedway at least once a week and sometimes twice a week for big money, and then these other events at Oakland, and I think he won another one up there. And so they go through the winter, and there's virtually no stop. Whether they drove back for Christmas or not, I don't know, but they would have races Christmas week, and then races on January the 2nd, January the 3rd. So whether he came back here for Christmas, because he always listed Anderson, Indiana as home, I don't know. That's for speculation. But he starts out the 33 season very well. And he's going to drive at Indianapolis again, the same car, but now Louis Meyer had sold the car. And because we're going to get into some heavy stuff, there's some light moments that I'd like to wind up with, so I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. And is as well known and well documented with the family. It was on April the 16th of 1933 that Bob Carey lost his life at the Legion Ascot Speedway. And he was making a qualifying run, and apparently the family tells us that the wife was always present whenever he raced. And on that particular occasion, there was an opportunity for her to get her hair done, and there'd been like a scheduling problem or something, and so she was getting her hair done and wasn't at the track when he was fatally injured. Now, whether that had ever happened before or not, but legend has it that she would always be there, and probably with the son, I don't know. But anyway, so he was fatally injured, and I think that was the last race on the West Coast before he was going to come back and run Indianapolis. And so apparently he thought, let's give them a track record that will hold for a while, something to remember us by while we're gone. And so he was a posthumous national champion. I'm not sure if he ran any championship races in 33 at the beginning or not. I mean, he ran AAA races, but as far as the championship is concerned, it may have been 32 was the only season that he ran, and he won the championship, which is truly remarkable. A couple of kind of ironies is that there were several Ascots, and it's a little bit like Madison Square Garden. Which one are we talking about? There's been 5, and just the same as there's been several Ascots. So from about, I think, 57 or so up until 1990, there was another track, Ascot Park in Gardena. J.C. Agajanian was the promoter, and the only connection was that they thought, well, let's use that name because Legion Ascot actually closed in early 1936. There was also a Southern Ascot, and I'm confusing the issue. Anyway, there was a car owner from either Rockford, Illinois, or somewhere in that area, midget owner, that some of you may remember, named Lee Carey. And he had a son named Bob. Kevin Olson drove for Lee Carey, and I'm sure some of you know Kevin Olson. But anyway, the son, Bob Carey, went out there, and in whatever year this was, I think 82 or 83 or something like that, there was a fatal accident, and Bob Carey, the son, lost his life. And the irony is, to my knowledge, there was no relationship between the two families, but there's two examples of a Bob Carey losing their life at an Ascot Speedway. Two different Bob Careys, different families, two different Ascots. Anyway, to lighten the thing up a little bit here, as I'm almost done, is, and I want to defend Lawson Harris, by the way. Louis Meyer nicknamed him Useless. Poor Lawson Harris, his nickname was Useless. And I think that over the years and over the decades and multi-decades, it comes to mean that maybe the guy really didn't belong in that position. And I think that where it came from was, and I'll defend him by saying that Louis Meyer called him that because he would just kid about the fact that you would be driving along and the riding mechanic sitting there with nothing to do. Well, that's not exactly true, because they did have a number of duties, not only working on the car, during practice and doing all-nighters and everything, but during the race, they would help read the signals from the pits, because we didn't have any two-way radios or spotters in those days. It's the driver reading the messages and then figuring the rest of it out for himself. Also, running on bricks would actually be a lot rougher than the surface that we've got here. The driver's hands would go to sleep. And I've had several riding mechanics tell me, the late Frankie Delroy told me this. He'd ride with Floyd Roberts and Al Gordon and Bill Cummings, and he said during the course of the race, they'd stick a hand over, and what it meant was massage my hand because it went to sleep. And so he said you'd massage the hand and then, hand on the wheel, and then he would hand the other one over because that was asleep as well. And then there was pumping the fuel pressure, or pumping the oil, but also during the Depression when they kind of had like an economy run where the tank only held 15 gallons, and in 1936, 37.5 gallons was the allotment for the full 500 miles, and we're beyond Bob Carey now, but I'm just throwing this in, that Lawson Harris would be pumping the fuel to get it down the line, because every quart was crucial. And so if in fact he was useless, then why would Louis Meyer use him himself in 33 and win the race, and then use him in 34 and 35 and use him again in 36 and win again, and then turn him over to Rex Mays? If he's useless, he wouldn't have done it 7 years in a row and been in the winning car twice. So I'll defend Lawson Harris on that. But anyway, the light moment that I was going to talk about was that when this car was sold from Louis Meyer, it was sold to a guy in Gary, Indiana named Joe Marks, M-A-R-K-S. And if you look through the mid-30s, Joe Marks always had first-rate equipment. In fact, they went on until 1941 was the last time they had cars. But in 1934, for instance, Kelly Patillo and Wilbur Shaw started 1-2 in Mark's cars. So that was sort of almost like a Penske at the time. Well, Joe Marks was the entrant, but the real the anchor of the family was his mother-in-law, and her name was Mary Falcone, and they were grocers from Gary, Indiana. And Mary Falcone was known as Grandma Marks, and she probably stood about 5'3", and she wore flowery dresses like Vicki Lawrence when she does Mama's Family. Or if you remember Dana Carvey doing the church lady, she'd wear the shoes like that, and a short and healthily plump lady, and this flowery dress, and she'd wear a little black jacket and a flat hat, you know, that you would see like Eliza Doolittle. Boy, I'm doing a lot of name dropping here, but one of the, like an Eliza Doolittle hat. And she was pretty much the boss of the operation. And Louis Meyer's wife told me this. She said they showed up to buy the car. Joe Marks and Grandma Marks and I don't know who else, but they showed up to buy the car. And when Joe Marks talked to Louis and agreed that the price was going to be, I think it was $6,000, which was a lot of money for, you know, late 32, early 33, but this was first-rate equipment. And apparently, when they had decided, yes, it's $6,000, Louis Meyer's wife said, Grandma Marks put her hand down her front and pulled out a wad of bills and counted them off, and they paid for the car in cash. True story. Anyway, I think probably that just about wraps up all the things that I can think of about, boy, not bad, Donald. But just to say that, oh, I do have a couple more. Duke Dinsmore, who actually was from Dayton, Ohio, born in West Virginia. You think of Duke Dinsmore, not Duke Nayland, but Duke Dinsmore, being from Dayton, Ohio. But he actually spent some time out in the Pacific Northwest running. And in fact, his name was Carlisle J. Dinsmore. And the reason that he was called Duke was not because he was a dapper dresser like Duke Nayland, but because of the fact that he had a rich lady that he knew that bought race cars for him, and they called her the Duchess, and so he got the nickname the Duke. Anyway, he talked about seeing Bob Carey when he was a young man and seeing Bob Carey race, and he said he had a physique like Foyt. He said he was built like a gorilla. He had a huge upper body and massive arms, and he just looked like he could, you know, break a tree stump, and so that was one. And then the other one was, too, that I had read, just one of the numerous things that I'd read before I came over. I read a profile about Henry Banks, who had been the 1950 national champion. And I met Henry Banks, and little did I know that in a little over, that in 1 year and 1 month's time, I would actually be employed by him. So I'll just throw that out, that I owe a great deal of gratitude to a lot of people. If I couldn't pick out one person, it would have to be a tie, and it would be between Henry Banks and Sid Collins. Anyway, to get back to what I'm supposed to be talking about, I'd read that Henry Banks, as a very young man, had competed in a race in Detroit and finished third to Bob Carey. And so when I met Henry and I mentioned that, he lit up. Not that he wasn't happy anyway, but he lit up and he said with great pride, he said, Bob Carey was my idol. And he said, that was huge for me to run against my idol and finish third. So I don't know how many other drivers that would make that claim. I'm sure there were many. But I will tell you from firsthand that Henry Banks, the national champion from 1950, that Bob Carey was and had been his idol.